What is globalization? As used in this text, globalization refers to the shift toward a more integrated and interdependent world economy. Globalization has several facets, including the globalization of markets and globalization of production. The globalization of markets. The globalization of markets refers to the merging of historically distinct and separate national markets into one huge global market. Falling barriers to cross border trade and investment has made it easier to sell internationally. It has been argued for some time that the taste and preferences of consumers in different nations are beginning to converge on some global norm, thereby helping create a global market. Consumer products such as Citigroup credit cards, Coca-Cola soft drinks, video games, McDonald's hamburgers, Starbucks coffee, IKEA furniture, and Apple iPhones are frequently held up as prototypical examples of this trend. The firms that produce these products are more than just benefactors of this trend. They also are facilitators of it. By offering the same basic product worldwide, they help create a global market. A company does not have to be the size of these multinational giants to facilitate and benefit from the globalization of markets. In the United States, for example, according to the International Trade Administration, more than 300,000 small and medium sized firms with fewer than 500 employees exported in 2017, accounting for 98% of the companies that exported that year. More generally, exports from small and medium sized companies accounted for 33% of the value of U.S. export and manufactured goods. Typical of these is B&S Aircraft Alloys, a New York company whose exports account for 40% of its 8 million annual revenues. The situation is similar in several other nations. For example, in Germany, a staggering 98% of small and mid-sized companies have exposure to international markets via either exports or international production. Since 2009, China has been the world's largest exporter, spending more than 2 trillion worth of products and services last year from its country to the rest of the world. Despite the global prevalence of Citigroup credit cards, McDonald's hamburgers, Starbucks coffee, and IKEA stores, for example, it is important to push it is important not to push too far the view that national markets are given away to the global market. As we shall see in later chapters, significant differences still exist among national markets along many relevant dimensions, including consumer taste and preferences, distribution channels, culturally embedded value systems, business systems, and legal regulations. Uber, for example, the fast growing ride for hire service, is finding that it needs to refine its entry strategy in many foreign cities in order to take differences in regulatory regimen into account. These differences frequently require companies to customize marketing strategies, product features, and operating practices to best match conditions in a particular country. The most global of markets are not typically markets for consumer products, where national differences in taste and preferences can still be important to act as a brake on globalization, but markets for industrial goods and materials that serve universal needs the world over. These include the markets for commodities such as aluminum, oil, and wheat, for industrial products such as microprocessors, DRAMs, computer memory chips, and commercial jet aircraft, for computer software, and for financial assets from U.S. Treasury bills to Eurobonds and futures on the Nikkei index or the euro. That being said, it is increasingly evident that many newer high technology consumer products such as Apple iPhone are being successfully sold the same way the world over. In many global markets, the same firms frequently confront each other as competitors in nation after nation. Coca Cola's rivalry with PepsiCo is a global one, as are the rivalries between Ford and Toyota, Boeing and Airbus, Caterpillar and Komatsu in earth moving equipment, General Electric and Rolls Royce in aero engines, Sony, Nintendo, and Microsoft in video game consoles, and Samsung and Apple in iPhones. If a firm moves into a nation not currently served by its rivals, many of those rivals are sure to follow to prevent their competitor from gaining an advantage. As firms follow each other around the world, they bring with them many of the assets that serve them well in other national markets. Their products, operating strategies, marketing strategies, and branch names, creating some homogeneity across markets. Thus, greater uniformity replaces diversity. In an increasing number of industries, it is no longer meaningful to talk about the German market, the American market, the Brazilian market, or the Japanese market for many firms. There is only the global market, the globalization of production. The globalization of production refers to the sourcing of goods and services from locations around the globe to take advantage of national differences in the cost and quality of factors of production, such as labor, energy, land, and capital. By doing this, companies hope to lower their overall cost structure and improve the quality of functionality of their product offering, thereby allowing them to compete more effectively. For example, Boeing has made extensive use of outsourcing to foreign suppliers. Consider Boeing's 777. Eight Japanese suppliers made parts for the fuselage, doors, and wings. A supplier in Singapore makes the doors for the noose landing gear. Three suppliers in Italy manufacture wing flaps, and so on. In total, some 30% of the 777 by value is built by foreign companies. And for its most recent jet airliner, the 787 Boeing has pushed this trend even further. Some 65% of some 65% of the total value of aircraft is outsourced to foreign companies, 35% of which goes to three major Japanese companies. Part of the Boeing's rationale for outsourcing so much production to foreign suppliers is that these suppliers are the best in the world at their particular activity. A global web of suppliers yields a better final product, which enhances the chances of Boeing winning a greater share of total orders from aircraft than its global rival, Airbus. Boeing also or Boeing also outsources some production to foreign countries to increase the chance that it will win significant orders from airlines based in that country. For a more detailed look at globalization of production at Boeing, see the accompanying management focus. Early outsourcing efforts were primarily confined to manufacturing activities such as those undertaken by Boeing and Apple. Increasingly, however, companies are taking advantage of modern communications technology, particularly the internet, to outsource service activities to low cost producers in other nations. The internet has allowed hospitals to outsource some radiology work to India, where images from MRI scans and the like are read at night while U.S. physicians sleep. The results are ready for them in the morning. Many software companies, including Microsoft, now use Indian engineers to perform test functions on software designs in the United States. The time difference allows Indian engineers to run debugging tests on software written in the United States when U.S. engineers sleep, transmitting the corrected code back to the United States over secure internet connections so that it is ready for the U.S. engineers to work on the following day. Dispersing value creation activities in this way can compress the time and lower the costs required to develop new software programs. Other companies, from computer markers to banks, are outsourcing customer service functions, such as customer call centers, to developing nations where labor is cheaper. Another example from healthcare workers in the Philippines transcribe American medical files, such as audio files from doctors seeking approval from insurance companies for performing a procedure. Some estimates suggest the outsourcing of many administrative procedures in healthcare, such as customer service and claims processing, could reduce healthcare costs in America by more than 100 billion. The economist Robert Reich has argued that as a consequence of the trend exemplified by companies such as Boeing, Apple, and Microsoft, in many cases, it is becoming irrelevant to talk about American products, Japanese products, German products, or Korean products. Increasingly, according to Rich, the outsourcing of productive activities to different suppliers results in a certain product that are global in nature, that is, global products. But as with the globalization of markets, companies must be careful not to push the globalization of production too far. As we will see in later chapters, substantial impediments still make it difficult for firms to achieve the optimal dis- dispersion of their productive activities to locations around the globe. These impediments include formal and informal barriers to trade between countries, barriers to foreign direct investment, transportation costs, issues associated with economic and political risk, and the sheer managerial challenge of coordinating a global dispersed supply chain. An issue for Boeing with the 787 Dreamliner, as discussed in the management focus. For example, government regulations ultimately limit the ability of hospitals to outsource the process of interpreting MRI scans to developing nations where radiologists are cheaper. Nevertheless, the globalization of markets and production will probably continue. Modern firms are important actors in this trend, their very actions fostering increased globalization. These firms, however, are merely responding in an efficient manner to changing conditions in their operating environment as well as they should. The emergence of global institutions. As markets globalize and an increasing proportion of business activity transcends national borders, institutions are needed to help manage, regulate, and police the global marketplace to promote the establishment of multinational treaties to govern the global business system. Over the past half century, a number of important global institutions have been created to help perform these functions, including the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trades, or the GATT, and its successor, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and its sister institution, the World Bank, and the United States nations. All these institutions were created by voluntary agreement between individual nation states, and their functions are enshrined into international treaties. The World Trade Organization, or the WTO, like the GATT before it, is primarily responsible for policing, policying the World Trade System and making sure nation states adhere to the rules laid down in trade treaties signed by WTO member sites. As of 2017, 164 nations that collectively accounted for 98% of the world trade were WTO members, thereby giving the organization enormous scope and influence. The WTO is also responsible for facilitating the establishment of additional multinational agreement among WTO members over its entire history and that of the GATT before it. The WTO has promoted the lowering of barriers to cross-border trade and investment. In doing so, the WTO has been the instrument of its member states, which have sought to create a more open global business system unencumbered by barriers to trade and investment between countries. Without an institution which, as the WTO, the globalization of markets and production is unlikely to have proceeded as far as it has. However, as we shall see in this chapter and in chapter 7, when we look closely at the WTO, critics charge that the organization is usurp, usurping the national sovereignty of individual national states. The International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, and the World Bank were both created in 1944 by 44 nations that met at the Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The IMF was established to maintain order in the international monetary system. The World Bank was set up to promote economic development. In the more than 7 decades since their creation, both institutions have emerged as significant players in the global economy. The World Bank is the less controversial of the two sister institutions. It has focused on making low interest loans to cash strapped governments and poor nations that wish to undertake significant infrastructure investments such as building dams or roads. The IMF is often seen as the lender of last resort to nation states whose economies are in turmoil and whose currencies are losing value against those of other nations. During the past 2 decades, for example, the IMF has lent money to the governments of troubled states, including Argentina, Indonesia, Mexico, Russia, South Carolina, South Korea, Thailand, and Turkey. More recently, the IMF took a proactive role in helping countries cope with some of the effects of the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. IMF loans come with strings attached. However, in return for loans, the IMF requires nation states to adopt specific economic policies aimed at returning their troubled economies to stability and growth. These requirements have sparked controversy. Some critics charge that the IMF's policy recommendations are often inappropriate. Others maintain that by telling national governments what economic policies they must adapt, the IMF, like the WTO, is usurping the sovereignty of nation states. We will look at the debate over the role of the IMF in Chapter 11. The United Nations was established October 24, 1945, by 51 countries committed to preserving peace through international cooperation and collective security. Today, nearly every nation in the world belongs to the United Nations. Membership now totals 103 nations. When states become members of the United Nations, they agree to accept the obligations of the UN Charter, an international treaty that established basic principles of international relations. According to the Charter, the UN has four purposes: to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations among nations, to cooperate in solving international problems and promoting respect for human rights, and to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations. Along the UN is perhaps best known for its peacekeeping role. One of the organization's central mandates is the promotion of higher standards of living, full employment, and conditions of economic and social progress and development. All issues that are central to the creation of a vibrant global economy. As much as 70% of the work of the UN system is devoted to accomplishing this mandate. To do so, the UN works closely with other international institutions such as the World Bank. Guiding the work is the belief that eradicating poverty and improving the well being of people everywhere are necessary steps in creating conditions for lasting peace. Another institution in the news is the Group of 20, or the G20. Established in 1999, the G20 comprises the finance ministers and central bank governors of 19 largest economies in the world, plus representatives from the European Union and the European Central Bank. Collectively, the G20 represents 90% of global GDP and 80% of international global trade. Originally established to formulate a coordinated policy response to financial crisis in developing nations in 2008 and 2009, it became the forum through which nations attempted to launch a coordinated policy response to the global finance crisis that started in America and then rapidly spread around the world, ushering in the first serious global economic recession since 1981. Drivers of globalization. Two macro factors underlie the trend toward greater globalization. The first is the decline in barriers to the free flow of goods, services, and capitals that has occurred in recent decades. The second factor is technological change, particularly the dramatic developments in communication, information processing, and transportation technologies. Decline in trade and investment barriers. During the 1920s and 1930s, many of the world's national states erected formidable barriers to international trade and foreign direct investment. International trade occurs when a firm exports goods or services to consumers in another country. Foreign direct investment, or the FDI, occurs when a firm invests resources in business activities outside its home country. Many of these barriers to international trade took the form of high tariffs on imports of manufactured goods. The typical aim of such tariff was to protect domestic industries from foreign competition. One consequence, however, was beggar thy neighbor. Retaliatory trade policies, with countries progressively raising trade barriers against each other. Ultimately, this depressed world demand and contributed to the Great Depression of the 1930s. Having learned from this experience, the advanced industrial nations of the West committed themselves after World War II to progressively reduce barriers to the free flow of goods, services, and capital among nations. This goal was enshrined in the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade. Under the umbrella of GATT, 8 rounds of negotiations among number among member states worked to lower barriers to the free flow of goods and services. The first round of negotiations went into effect in 1948. The most recent negotiations to be completed, known as the Urugari round, were finalized in December 1993. The Ugari round further reduced trade barriers, extended GATT to cover services as well as manufactured goods. Manufactured goods provided enhanced protection for patents, trademarks, and copyrights, and established the World Trade Organization to police the international trade system. Table 1.1 summarizes the impact of GATT agreements on average tariff rates for manufactured goods. As can be seen, average tariff rates have fallen significantly since 1950 and now stand at about 1.6%. Comparable tariff rates in 2017 for China and India were 3.4 and 7.1% respectively. Figure 1.1 reports on the value of world trade, world production, and active regional trade agreements in the world, along with the world population from 1960 to 2020, the last 4 years being forecast data. Trade and production are indexed to 100 in 1960. The figure illustrates some interesting change in globalization trends. For example, according to the World Trade Organization, the value of world trade in merchandise goods has grown consistently faster than the growth rate in the world economy since 1950. And the chart showed, and the chart shows that this growth has been markedly higher since the turn of the century. As a consequence, by 2020, the value of the world trade is expected to be 167 times larger than it was in 1960, whereas the world economy will be 65 times larger. This trend has continued into the modern era. Between 2000 and 2020, the value of the world trade increased 3.3 times, whereas the world economy has increased 2.6 times. Perhaps the most obvious Perhaps the most obvious difference is between world trade and world production. Trade across country borders is 2.6 times higher than world production, a figure that has gone up drastically since 2000. The forecast is also that world trade will continue to increase more rapidly than world production for the foreseeable future. The difference in the growth rates of world production and world trade is why studying international business is so important. While we produce more goods and services today compared with before, a far greater proportion of that production is being traded across national borders than at any time in modern history. Moreover, the knowledge society that we live in has resulted in consumers knowing more than ever about goods and services being produced worldwide. From a consumer perspective, this is the driving demand for international traded goods. Thus, the larger the difference between the growth rates of world trade and world production, the greater the extent of globalization and more important it becomes to understand international business. Additionally, despite the recent wave of nationalism around the world, e.g., Brexit's 2016 U.S. presidential election, many countries have been progressively removing restrictions to foreign direct investment over the past 20 years. According to the United Nations, some 80% of the 1,440 changes made worldwide since 2000 in the laws governing foreign direct investment created a more favorable environment for FDI. Basically, the pressure from customers to avoid to make the pressure from customers to make available any goods and services anywhere for their needs and wants has been facilitated by country government removing restrictions on imports to their countries. Such customer pressures and restrictions removal by countries have been driving both the globalization of markets and the globalization of production. The lowering of barriers to international trade enables firms to view the world rather than a single country as their market. The lowering of trade and investment barriers also allows firms to base production at the optimal location for that activity. Thus, a firm might design a product in one country, produce component parts in two other countries, assemble the product in yet another country, and then export the finished product around the world. Another important facilitator of trade across country borders is the increased number of trade agreements that have been implemented in the world. Figure 1.1 reports on regional trade agreements in force today. More than two countries involved, with another roughly 300 bilateral trade agreements between two countries also active worldwide. There is no doubt that that trade, at least between the countries in a trade agreement, has been a strong reason for the increase overall in world trade. Figure 1.1 illustrates the almost 1-in-1 match of the trade agreement and the world trade curves on the chart. That is, as regional trade agreements in force increase year by year, so does world trade across country borders at the same pace. Two additional implications can be gleaned from the data from Figure 1.1 that could become important for the global marketplace. These are illustrated in separate charts in Figure 1.2. The first implication relates to sustainability, a topic we will cover much more in Chapter 5. In 2000, the United States nations established the Millennium Dependent Goals to reduce the number of people who live in extreme poverty by 2015. Subsequent, subsequently, Subsequently, in September 2015, United Nations and its 193 member countries ratified the Sustainable Development Goals that set targets to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure prosperity for all countries by 2030 as part of a new sustainable agenda. The urgency of delivering on UN sustainable development goals can be traced to the difference between the world production and population data. As world production approaches the total population curve, we can infer that resource availability for all our needs and wants in the world's 260 countries and territories will potentially be drastically constrained. The chart in Figure 1.1 also indicates that our needs worldwide are still rather spiky and not flat as Tom Friedman projected in 2004. Trading across country borders is significantly more pronounced today than ever before, growing at a rate above the population growth of the world. These two curves are likely to not intersect anytime soon, and coupled with large difference between world trade and world production, especially in the last 20 years, we will see a world consumer market where localized needs and wants are still very much unique in a large set of industries and product categories. Overall, through the fact that the volume of world trade has been growing faster than world GPA implies several things. The fact that the volume of the world trade has been growing faster than world GDP implies several things. First, more firms are doing what Boeing does with the 777 and 787, dispersing parts of their production process to different locations around the globe to drive down production costs and increase product quality. Second, the economies of the world nation states are becoming ever more intertwined. As trade expands, nations are becoming increasingly dependent on each other for important goods and services. Third, the world has become significantly wealthier in the last 2 decades. The implication is that rising trade is the engine that has helped pull the global economy along. Evidence also suggests that foreign direct investment is playing an increasing role in the global economy as firms increase their cross-border investments. The average yearly outflow of FDI increased from 14 billion to 1970 to 1.5 trillion in the most recent year. 2016, audited by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the UNCTAD. As a result of the strong FDI flow by 2016, the global stock of FDI was about 27 trillion. More than 80,000 parent companies had more than 800,000 affiliates in foreign markets that collectively employed more than 75 million people abroad and generated value accounting for about 11% of global GDP. The foreign affiliates of multinationals around 36 trillion in global sales, higher than the value of global exports of goods and services, which stood at close to 23.4 trillion. The globalization of markets and production and the resulting growth of world trade, foreign direct investment, and imports all imply that firms are finding their home markets under attack from foreign competitors. This is true in China, where U.S. companies such as Apple, General Motors, and Starbucks are expanding their presence. It is true in the United States, where Japanese automobile firms have taken market share away from General Motors and Ford over the past 3 decades. And it is true to it is true in Europe, where the once dominant Dutch company Philips has seen its market share in the consumer electronics industry taken by Japanese Panasonic and Sony, and Korea's Samsung and LG. The growing integration of the world's economy into a single huge marketplace is increasingly the intensity of competition in a range of manufacturing and service industries. However, declining barriers to cross border trade and investment cannot be taken for granted. As we shall see in the subsequent chapters, demands for protection from foreign competitors are still often heard in countries around the world, including the United States. Although a return to the restrictive trade policies of the 1920s and 1930s is unlikely, it is not clear whether the political majority in the industrialized world favors further reduction in trade barriers. Indeed, the global financial crisis of 2008 through 2009 and the associated drop in global output that occurred led to more calls for trade barriers to protect jobs at home. If trade barriers decline no further, this may slow the rate of globalization of both markets and production. Role of technology, tech, not tech, not role of technological change. Technological change. The lowering of trade barriers made globalization of markets and production a theoretical possibility. Technological change has made it a tangible reality. Every year that goes by comes with unique and oftentimes major advances in communication, information processing, and transportation technology, including the explosive emerge of Internet of Things. Communications. Perhaps the single most important innovation since World War II has been the development of the microprocessor, which enabled the explosive growth of high power, low cost computing, vastly increasing the amount of information that can be processed by individuals and firms. The microprocessor also underlines many recent advances in telecommunications technology. Over the past 30 years, global communications have been revolutionized by developments in satellite, optical fiber, wireless technologies, and of course the internet. These technologies rely on the microprocessor to encode, transmit, and decode the vast amount of information that flows along these electronic highways. The cost of microprocessors continues to fall while their power increases, a phenomenon known as Moore's Law, which predicts that the power of the microprocessor technology doubles and its cost of production falls in half every 18 months. Internet of Things. The explosive growth of the internet since 1944, when the first web browser was introduced, is the latest expression of the development of the so called Internet of Things. Tracing back about 3 decades to 1990, fewer than 1 million users are connected to the internet. By 1995, the figure had risen to 50 million. By 27, the internet had 3.8 billion users, or 51% of the global population. As such, 2017 marked the first year that more than half of the world's population were internet users. It is no surprise that the internet has developed into the information backbone of global economy. In North America, e-commerce retail sales will surpass 520 billion in 2020, up from almost nothing in 1998, while global e-commerce sales surpassed 2 billion for the first time in 2017. Viewed globally, the internet has emerged as an equalizer. It rolls back some of the constraints of location, scale, and time zones. The internet makes it much easier for buyers and sellers to find each other wherever they may be located in whatever. their size. It allows businesses, both large and small, to expand their global presence at a lower cost than ever before. Just as important, it enables enterprises to coordinate and control a globally dispersed production system in a way that was not possible 25 years ago. Transportation technology. In addition to the developments in communications technology, several major innovations in transportation technology have occurred since the 1950s. In economic terms, the most important are probably the development of commercial jet aircraft and super freighters and the introduction of containerization, which simplifies transshipment from one mode of transport to another. The advent of commercial jet travel, by reducing the time needed to get from one location to another, has effectively shrunk the globe. In terms of travel time, New York is now closer to Tokyo than it was to Philadelphia in colonial days. Containerization has revolutionized the transportation business, significantly lowering the cost of shipping goods over long distances because the international shipping industry is responsible for carrying about 90% of the volume of world trade in goods. This has, this has been an extremely important development. Before the advent of containerization, moving goods from one mode of transfer to another was very labor intensive, lengthy, and costly. It could take days and several hundred longshore workers to upload and ship and reload goods onto trucks and trains. With the advent of widespread containerization in the 1970s and 1980s, the whole process can now be executed by a handful of longshore workers in a couple of days. As a result of the efficiency gains associated with containerization, transportation costs have plummeted, making it much more economic to ship goods around the globe, thereby helping drive the globalization of markets and production. Between 1920 and 1990, the average ocean freight and port charges per ton of U.S. export and cargo fell from $95 to $29 in 19 in in 1990 dollars. Today, the typical cost of transporting a 20-foot container from Asia to Europe carrying more than 20 tons of cargo is about the same as the economy airfare for a single passenger on the same journey. Implications for the globalization of production. As transportation costs associated with the globalization of production have declined, dispersal of production to geographically separated locations have become more economical. As a result of the technological innovations discussed earlier, the real cost of information processing and communication have fallen dramatically in the past 2 decades. These developments make it possible for a firm to create and then manage a globally dispersed production system, further facilitating the globalization of production. A worldwide communication network has become essential for many international businesses. For example, Dell uses the internet to coordinate and control a globally dispersed production system to such an extent that it holds only 3 days worth of inventory as its assembly locations. Dell's internet-based system records orders for computer equipment as they are submitted by customers via the company's website and then immediately transmit the resulting orders for components to various suppliers around the world, which have a real-time look at Dell's order flow and can adjust their production schedules accordingly. Given the low cost of air freight, Dell can use air transportation to speed up delivery of critical components to meet unanticipated demand shifts without delaying the shipment of final product to consumers. Dell has also used modern communications technology to outsource its customer service operations to India. When U.S. customers call Dell with a service inquiry, they are routed to Bangalore in India, where English speaking service personnel handle the call. And implications for the globalization of markets. In addition to the globalization of production, technological innovations have facilitated the globalization of markets. Low cost global communication networks, including those built on top of the internet, are helping create electronic global marketplaces. As noted earlier, low cost transportation has made it more economical to ship products around the world, thereby helping create global markets. In addition, low cost jet travel has resulted in mass movement of people between countries. This has reduced the cultural distance between countries. It is bringing about some convergence of consumer tastes and preferences. At the same time, global communication networks and global media are creating a worldwide culture. U.S. television networks such as CNN and HBO are now received in many countries. Hollywood films are shown the world over, while non U.S. news networks such as BBC and Al Jazeera also have a global footprint. In any society, the media are primary conveyors of culture. As global media develop, we must expect the evolution of something akin to the global culture. A logical result of this evolution is the emergence of global markets for consumer products. Clear signs of this is apparent. It is now as easy to find a McDonald's restaurant in Tokyo as it is in New York. To buy an iPad in Rio is as it is in Berlin, and to buy Gap jeans in Paris as it is in San Francisco. Despite these trends, we must be careful not to overemphasize their importance. While modern communications and transportation technologies are ushering in the global village, significant national differences remain in culture, consumer preferences, and business practices. A firm that ignores differences among countries does so at its peril. We shall stress this point repeatedly throughout this text and elaborate on it in later chapters. The changing demographics of the global economy. Hand in hand with the trend toward globalization has been a fairly dramatic change in the demographics of the global economy over the past 30 years. As late as the 1960s, four stylized facts describe the demographics of the global economy. The first was U.S. dominance in the world economy and world trade picture. The second was U.S. dominance in the world foreign direct investment related to this. The third fact was the dominance of large multinational U.S. firms on the international business scene. The fourth was that roughly half the globe, the centrally planned economies of the communist world, was off limits to Western international businesses. All four of these facts have changed rapidly. The changing world output and world trade picture. In the early 1960s, the United States was still by far the world's dominant industrial power. In 1960, the United States accounted for 38.3% of world output measured by gross domestic product (GDP). By 2018, the United States accounted for 15.8% of world output, with China now at 17.1% of world input and the global leader in this category. See Table 1.2. The United States was not the only developed nation to see its relative standing slip. The same occurred to Germany, France, Italy, and the United Kingdom and Canada as just a few examples. These were all nations that were among the first to industrialize globally. Of course, the change in the U.S. position was not as absolute decline was not an absolute decline because the U.S. economy grew significantly between 1960 and 2018. The economies of Germany, France, Italy, and the United Kingdom and Canada also grew during this time. Rather, it was a relative decline reflecting the faster economic growth of several other economies, particularly China, as well as several other nations in Asia. For example, as can be seen from Table 1-2, from 1960 to today, China's share of world output increased from a trivial amount to 17.1%, making it the world's largest economy in terms of its share in the world output. The U.S. is still the largest economy overall. Other countries that markedly increased their share of world output include Japan, Thailand, Malaysia, Taiwan, Brazil, and South Korea. By the end of the 1980s, the U.S. position as the world's leading trading nation was being challenged. Over the past 30 years, South Korea and China have taken a large share of world exports. During the 1960s, the United States routinely accounted for 20% of world exports of manufactured goods such as 1.2 and manufactures goods. But as Table 1.2 shows, the U.S. share of world exports of goods and services had slipped to 8.2% by 2017, significantly behind that of China. As emerging economies such as Brazil, Russia, India, and China coin the BRIC countries continue to grow, a further relative decline in the share of world output and world exports accounted for by the United States and other long established development nations seems likely. By itself, this is not bad. The relative decline of the United States reflects the growing economic development and industrialization of the world economy, as opposed to an absolute decline in the health of the U.S. economy. More forecasts now predict a continued rise in the share of world output accounted for by developing nations such as China, Russia, India, Indonesia, Thailand, South Korea, Mexico, and Brazil. And common the commensurate decline in the share enjoyed by rich industrialized countries such as United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, and United States. The United Kingdom in particular presents an interesting case study in Britain's exit from the European Union, Brexit's looming. Perhaps more importantly, if current trends continue, the Chinese economy could ultimately be longer than that of the United States on a purchasing power, partially based basis as well, while the economy of India will become the third largest by 2030. Overall, the World Bank has estimated that today's developing nations may account for more than 60% of world economic activity by 2025, while today's rich nations, which currently account for more than 55% of world economic activity, may account for only about 38%. Forecasters are not always correct, but these suggest that a shift in the economic geography of the world is now underway. Although the magnitude of that shift is not totally evident, for international businesses, the implications of this changing economic geography are clear. Many of tomorrow's economic opportunities may be found in the developing nations of the world, and many of tomorrow's most capable competitors will probably also emerge from these regions. A case in point, a case in point has been dramatic expansion of India's software sector, which is profiled in the accompanying country focus. The changing foreign direct investment picture, reflecting the dominance of the United States in the global economy. U.S. firms accounted for 66.3% of worldwide foreign direct investment flows in 1960. British firms were second, accounting for 10.5%, while Japanese firms were a distant 8 with only 2%. The dominance of U.S. firms was so great that books were written about the economic threat posed by Europe by U.S. corporations. Several European governments, most notably France, talked of limiting inward investment by U.S. firms. However, as the barriers to the free flow of goods, services, and capital fell, and as other countries increased their shares of world output, non-U.S. firms increasingly began to invest across national borders. The motivation for this foreign direct investment by non-U.S. firms was the desire to disperse production activities to optimal locations and to build a direct presence in major foreign markets. Thus, beginning in the 1970s, European and Japanese firms began to shift labor-intensive manufacturing operations from their home markets to developing nations where labor costs were lower. In addition, many Japanese firms invested in North America and Europe, often as a hedge against unfavorable currency movements and the possible imposition of trade barriers. For example, Toyota, the Japanese automobile company, rapidly increased its investment in automobile production facilities in the United States and Europe during the late 1980s and 1990s. Toyota executives believed that an increasingly strong Japanese yen would price Japanese automobile exports out of foreign markets. Therefore, production in the most important foreign markets as opposed to exports from Japan made sense. Toyota also undertook these investments to head off growing political pressures in the United States and Europe to restrict Japanese automobile exports into these markets. One consequence of these developments illustrated in Figure 1.3, which shows how the stock of foreign direct investments by the United States, China, Japan, United Kingdom, European Union countries, developed economies, and the world changed between 1995 and today. The stock of foreign direct investment, or the FDI, refers to the total cumulative value of foreign investments as a percentage of the country's GDP. As expected in all cases, figure 1.2, we invest more today outside of our country than we did in 1995. For example, U.S. firms invested 17.8% of the nation's GDP outside the country in 1995, and now that figure is 34.4%. Collectively, the 196 countries in the world today invest 36% of their GDP outside its country borders, and increased from 12.8% in 1995. Bottom line, the world is becoming more globalized in investment mentality, and opportunities are no longer as restricted at the home country of a firm as they used to be even as recent as in 1995. Figure 1.4 illustrates two other important trends: the, the sustained growth in cross border flows of foreign direct investment that has occurred since 1990, and the increasing importance of developing nations as the destination of foreign direct investment. Throughout the 1990s, the amount of investment directed at both developed throughout the 1990s, the amount of investment directed at both developed nations increased dramatically, a trend that reflects the increasing internationalization of business corporations. A surge in foreign direct investments from 1998 to 2000 was followed by a slump from 2001 to 2004, associated with a slowdown in global economic activity after the collapse of a financial bubble of the late 1990s and 2000. The growth of the foreign direct investment resumed at normal levels for that time in 2005 and continued upwards through 2006.